Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Joan DeJean. Joan is a trustee professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of 11 books, to my latest count, on French literature, history, and material culture. And today we will speak about her latest book, Mutinous Woman, how French convicts became founding mothers of the Gulf Coast. John, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Alain. Thank you for your interest in my book.
So yes, this is a great part of, I feel, a neglected part of the U.S. history, which is the French part, the Louisiana part. I guess once it was bought by from Napoleon, then people forgot about the rest of the history. How is it that this French colony expanded throughout the time, from the first arrival of the French until it was sold to the rest of the United States? So I have so many questions, but before we get there, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself. We were speaking in French a few minutes ago, so tell us about your past, and then how is it that you became a professor in French literature, history, and all these other subjects that you cover.
Okay, thank you, Alain. I was born in Southwest Louisiana, which at the time was quite Francophone still, and both sides of my family spoke either French or Cajun French, the patois, the dialect, as a first language. My parents, both my parents, all my grandparents. And my generation, however, was less Francophone, and my grandparents felt that it was not one had to have English as a first language. So my rebellion was always very easy. I continued to do French, even though they wanted me to do only English and to become a doctor. I was a French major, and I went to graduate school, and I worked on 18th century France, which I've always loved. So my life has been sort of an easy progression in many ways. After graduate school, I began immediately starting to work in libraries and archives in France, doing research. And I've worked on, over the years, on various topics, always dealing with the end of the 17th century and the first half or all of the 18th century in France. And I've worked in various ways on all kinds of different figures and different aspects of the period. And one of the things I've done through the years is often work on either types of works or authors who were censored, and for different reasons. And that meant that I've spent a lot of time in the archives of the police and the prisons in Paris, trying to find people who were arrested, either because their works were considered subversive or because they were accused of a crime for some reason. And so that's my past and how I got into this current project.
Okay, and before we get to your
Sure.
work and the censorship of of those authors in France, I wonder if you could tell us: is the French language dead in Louisiana, or are there still pockets of French language alive?
There are certainly small pockets of French where French is still alive in Louisiana, not at all anymore as it was even when I was a child and growing up there. It's quite disappeared. I think television was the main culprit, and once that became introduced into all homes, then people heard English all the time, and everybody has television. Nobody did when I was growing up there. So we didn't have that constant invasion of English. And so now it isn't at all an active language there. It's not like Quebec.
Okay, and the small French that is still less in Louisiana, how different it is from, let's say, French from France, or let's say French from Quebec?
It's very different from French from France, and it's very different from, I mean, there's so many variants of French in Quebec that it's hard to discuss all of this. It's not standard French at all in Louisiana, that much I'll say. It's not a written language, or very rarely a written language.
Right. Okay. Now going back to your work, so you focus mostly on censor authors. I mean, from the 18th century or 17th centuries, that must not have been difficult, because at that time, if you say anything against religion, for example, you were already a censor author. So first of all, why do you focus on this kind of authors as opposed to the better known authors that everybody else knows a little bit more about?
Oh, I don't know. I've always been attracted to topics, I think, that led me into police files. Not always, because I spent a good period of my life when I worked on the history of Paris, for example, and I didn't deal with the police and censorship. It was wonderful for a while, because it's often depressing to work. The book we're going to talk about was a very hard book to do work on, because it was so, the stories were so painful to discover. So
Okay.
it's hard to do it, and so sometimes I just say, no, I can't do it anymore, and I quit and do something else.
Okay, well then, can you take us back to the period of the topic of this book? What period is it? What's going on in France, and more particular, what's going on in Paris culturally and politically?
Okay, it's the very early 18th century, specifically the decades, the years just after Louis XIV's death in 1715. It's a time when France was in financial, to say difficulty would be an understatement, near bankruptcy. Louis XIV had fought in enormously expensive wars during all the last years of his reign, and wars are expensive, so France was really bankrupt. This created an enormous financial havoc at the period, and the regent who was governing France brought in allowed a younger French, Scottish financier named John Law to take over the French economy and to use it. It was like giving the reins of all the French economy, and it was the biggest economy in Europe. It was giving it over to a young financial whiz kid, and he let him try out all his theories. So he introduced a bank, paper money, a stock market. And the stock market boomed in 1719. So there's a lot of financial havoc at the period. In addition, France knew in the years just preceding this huge, what we would call climate change today. The climate was extremely harsh. In particular, there were a series of extraordinarily harsh winters. And as a result, the crops were killed. There were no harvests. And, France is an agricultural economy still today. It was a massively agricultural economy in the early 18th century. And there were years in which there was no grain harvest in most of the regions of France where grain was produced massively. And this meant that bread, which was the real foundation of the French diet, was very scarce. So there's famine. Huge famine and a lot of disease as a result of this, and thousands and thousands and thousands of very poor people descended on Paris because they kept hoping that cities would have food when there was no food in the countryside. So you have masses of poor people wandering around the country, a huge death toll from this. It was, in other words, a difficult period for the country, and a period of huge upheaval in many ways.
Just because my podcast focus a little bit on economics, I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit more about John Law's and for example, the circulation of paper currency, which was a new invention at that time.
Oh, yes. Everything he was doing, there was new. There was a national bank in England, yes, but the French had never had anything like that, had no experience with any kind of banking that could be called modern, and to introduce that paper currency, which is something no nation in Europe had, a stock based on the Indies Company, the French trading company, all of this introduced in the same time, in just about a year's time. That's the kind of economic and financial upheaval that countries never know. The French were thrust from a traditional financial economy into the modern age in a year's time. And I don't think that's really possible to do without a lot of government oversight, and there was none. John Law was allowed to print as much money, to print paper money, and he could print as much as he wanted to print. I mean, I think it's hard for people to imagine these kinds of conditions. He was allowed to take over control of the Indies Company, which controlled all of France's overseas trade. And he was allowed to print stock based on the Indies Company and to do whatever he wanted. He decided that he had to have some foundation for this stock market. And he decided he would make Louisiana, which was the French colony across the Atlantic in what is now the United States. And it was a huge territory, Louisiana. It was the whole Gulf Coast, including parts of, from all across the Gulf of Mexico, high up on that, far east, nearly to the East Coast, and all up and down the Mississippi Valley to Illinois. So where it rejoined the French possessions in New France, farther north, but all this huge territory was virtually unpopulated by Europeans and had had almost no French investment at that time. And John Law says, okay, I'm going to make this hugely profitable. It's going to be as profitable as the English colonies, which were up and down the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States, and which had a flourishing economy and a big workforce at that time. He said, I'm going to introduce tobacco, because the English colonies were profitable above all because they exported so much tobacco to Europe. And the French loved tobacco at this time. They were buying a lot of it. So their money was flooding to England. But he said, no, Louisiana's tobacco will be more profitable than English tobacco. And I guarantee it, within a year, we'll be making these vast profits. And he made promises about how much they would be making in a year's time. And people believed him. So they invested in the Indies Company stock that he was setting up, and it boomed because of this. No one knew or bothered to ask if tobacco would grow on the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. And of course, the climate is very different from the climate on the East Coast, and it couldn't grow. But nobody knew this until later. So all of this starts and the stock market booms. You can imagine this is a period of true financial change and true financial havoc in Paris.
Wow. Just to make it a reference with today's economy, it almost makes me think of cryptocurrency, and everyone flocked into cryptocurrency and wanted to buy because that's where the money is going to be. And well,
we don't know. I agree with you totally. I think about it all the time. I think cryptocurrency is the logical successor to this moment of John Law, if you see what I mean. It's the same kind of thing, getting people to believe in something new. Because before, money had always been gold and silver, something you could touch, something you could hold. And John Law believes in theoretical money, right? And he gets the country to buy into this massively in just a few months' time with these guarantees of profits. To compare it to today, if you bought a share of Indies Company stock in May 1719, when it went on sale, you could buy a share for 500 pounds, French pounds, livres. In December 1719, that share was worth over 10,000 pounds, livres. So think of the profit on theoretically that people made. It all collapsed when anyone tried to cash in their stock because there was no foundation for any of this, and everything just fell apart. So there was a boom, a bubble, a bust, all within a year's time.
Okay, well, then to go back into the topic of the book, there is a sense that we want to populate Louisiana, and there are some women needed there because it's all full of men. So can you now take us back to the story of how is it that we are gathering all these women to, you tell us.
It's exactly what we've been talking about. John Law has gotten everyone to focus on the profits that will come out of Louisiana. And then all of a sudden he realizes that, you have to sort of populate a country of a colony in order to make it successful. There are some men in Louisiana, there are not that many. He promises to send a certain number of colonists. He sends more men. It's easier to find men who will accept to immigrate, but has no luck in finding women, and he wants to find women. So what does he do? He always just finds very neat solutions. He decides that he can have women arrested in Paris, or he can take women from the French women's prison, the Parisian women's prison, and he will just send them over to Paris. He doesn't come up with the idea himself. The woman who was the warden of this women's prison, gets the idea that everybody knows he wants colonists, and she thinks this would be wonderful if prisons were overcrowded then as they are today, and as she says, she can clear out her prison in part by sending them over to Louisiana. And then they get more ambitious and decide we can arrest more women. And this all starts. So at the same time as the stock market was booming, just when the stock market was taking off, because of a belief that tobacco would grow in Louisiana, they start arresting women. And you see the arrest record. So nobody was paying any attention to what was going on. They were just arresting.
Wow. And they were arresting people many times. Well, as you highlight in your books, we've made up charges. So people who had some kind of minor offense, all of a sudden they are shipped to the new world.
Absolutely. We have a list of the women who were proposed, but they called it deportation, and crimes are listed there. So I tried investigating all of those crimes. I found no guilt for any of the crimes. One of the women accused of theft did admit that she had stolen something. She was a laundress. She was incredibly poor. Her arresting officer commented on how thin she was, how terribly thin, how miserably dressed she was. These were poor women. She admitted that one day she had gone into a place where you could get food in Paris, we would call it a restaurant, and she'd eaten a plate of beef stew and drunk a glass of red wine. She described it in detail. And then, and I quote, she snuck out because she didn't have a cent to her name. So a crime like this was considered theft, and people were just women were put into the boats and sent off. But most of them were labeled on this list prostitutes. I can assure you that these women were not prostitutes.
Wow. Okay. So can you tell us, and you told us in the book, but how many women were put together in a ship? What were the traveling conditions, and how many survived the trip to Louisiana?
Yeah, I can't tell you exactly, Alain, because the people who were in charge of the bureaucracy of compiling the lists, etc., were so careless that they made all kinds of mistakes. But I'm relatively certain that lots of women were arrested. Many women were proposed. In the end, they did it all like at the last minute and casually, and about 132 women, I think, were chained to each other at the waist and put in carts and taken to the French coast to board ships. And of these 132 women, approximately 62 survived, I think. They traveled in conditions that were, I think none of these trips were easy at the period. These were really horrific conditions. They were traveling in winter, in December and January. They were chained in the ship's hold because they'd been pronounced dangerous criminals. The French John Law controlled all trade, remember? They took a ship that was destined and used otherwise before this crossing and afterwards for the slave trade from West Africa to the French islands in the Caribbean. And they sent for this one trip, the ship went to Le Havre, the French port, and there it picked up the women and took them to Louisiana. So they were chained in the hold of a slave ship. And during the crossing, this was a crossing where remember, flour is scarce, the economy's in havoc. They hadn't put enough provisions on board for the crew. So there was nothing left for the women. My bet is that they were barely fed during the crossing. So these are the kinds of conditions in which they traveled.
So I just like to highlight that less than 50%
Mhm.
of them made it alive to the other side. That's just horrible. I mean, I can imagine the horrible conditions under which they were chained, but not to make it alive. I mean, and more than 50% to die in the trip. That's just horrendous.
It is, and it wasn't over yet, because when they got there, they were landed, and there was the only port that functioned in the colony at this point. Not much functioned in the French colony. The only port was on an island off the coast of what is now Alabama, and they didn't want them on the island. They had some construction on the island, some housing, but they were dangerous, right? They didn't want these criminals. So they put them in rowboats, and they rowed them to another island. It would have been several days travel away. And there they left them on the island, but this island had no fresh water, no storage for food. Food was not grown there. They had no blankets, they had no provisions, and I don't know how long they were there, but even a day on this island would have been another incredible hardship, and they left them for longer than a day, and they had to fend for themselves and get whatever they could find. And this was in February, and the Gulf of Mexico is much warmer than, say, the Atlantic, but in February it's not warm. So they were left in those conditions, and then finally their luck changed in a way, because they were taken onto shore, and once again, no provision for them. There was never housing for them. There was nothing, no shelter on this island, not even tents. They left them on the beach in what is now the state of Mississippi, but nobody wanted them still, and there was no jail to lock them up. There was no provision. So they realized that they were free finally after all of this, and so they just started leaving and making their way. And a few months later, these same women who were left there in March of 1720 by now on the beach in Mississippi, by June of 1720, some of these women had made it up the Mississippi to a city which was being created at the time, and that we know as New Orleans, and they were being married there. Others had gone along the coast and were being married in other towns. Some of them got as far north as Illinois, others to places like Arkansas. I mean, really remote, distant and remote places, and they were traveling all over and marrying and beginning new lives. So it's an extraordinary story of all of a sudden, because no one cares, those who had survived were pretty tough women by this point. I don't know what they were like before this, and they were resourceful, so they remade their lives.
Well, this is where I have a little bit of a hard time digesting this information, because after this trip, where only less than 50% survived, those survivors, they were skinny and weak and
Yeah.
almost defenseless. And in addition to that, they were young women. You mentioned some of them were 16, 17, so how afraid could a person in Louisiana who is already acclimatized to all these rough conditions be afraid of an 18-year-old skinny girl, and in a place where there are no women, and the most desirable thing is to have the female company at that moment?
I totally agree. It's a question nobody that asked at the time, and no one has asked since. I cannot even imagine all of this. The French officials in the colony continued to complain about how dangerous they were, and how they were a detriment to the colony. Some people wanted to send them away again, to deport them again. The legends that arose around these women from the start are truly extraordinary, because there is during all those years, and some of them lived in the colony until much longer lives than they would have lived in France. Some of them were still there in the 1760s, the late 1760s. One even lives till 1780. So they lived long lives there, and they committed no crimes. These were
Wow.
not dangerous women, right? They were women who were unjustly accused, treated miserably. And when they got there, some of them were even younger than 16. One of them was barely 12
Wow.
when she
Wow.
got there. So come on, talk to me about dangerous. But they were treated that way and considered that way. And they just went on. They just didn't accept it. Nobody kept track of them ever.
Wow.
No one wondered where they were, how many had survived, what they were doing with their lives. They, in this vast and almost unpopulated by Europeans territory, they just went on and started things. So in all the settlements that become important in this colony, these women were there right at the start, and they're some of the founders of those settlements.
Just to take you a little bit on a sideline, you mentioned that the ship where they were brought in was a ship that was used for the slave trade. I wonder, what was France's relationship to the slave trade at that time?
Well, it varied immensely, as you know, I'm sure know, in depending on the colony. In the Caribbean, the slave trade was already on Martinique and Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti after the Haitian Revolution. The slavery was already quite developed, and it would become much more developed, but it was already quite accepted and developed. In this colony called Louisiana, that is the colony that in the future United States, slavery was not developed in 1718 to 19, when John Law took over. Louis XIV had never been in favor of it. There was no agriculture requiring a labor force. Louisiana just sort of existed without it. I think there were a total of fewer than 12 enslaved Africans in all of this huge territory when John Law's work on it began, and they had been brought there by people like the governor Bienville. They were not brought from France on ships for Louisiana. At the same time as John Law promised to send colonists, and that promise, the women became part of that promise, he promised to send enslaved Africans, and he did. In numbers. So the first shiploads of enslaved Africans from West Africa to this colony arrived just a couple of months before the women arrived. So they arrived there, these women, along with slavery.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's not a good thing for John Law's
No, and it changed the whole future. And really, slavery was based on tobacco, because the English on the East Coast used slave labor for tobacco, which is an extremely labor-intensive crop to grow. But in Louisiana, it didn't work. So in addition, he was bringing slavery there when there was no need for it for the agriculture of the time. Later on, of course, Louisiana, all the places that are part of this French colony, but find a new crop, which is cotton. Right. But that's a long way off.
Right. Okay. Well, the crux of the book is that this woman became prosperous, or at the end of the day, they ended up having a better life that they were having, the ones that survived, of course, that they were having in Paris, where they were poor and they were always against, society was against them. In this new territory, some of them were able to make a life for themselves. Can you highlight some of those examples?
Okay, I'll give you a couple of examples of different kinds of lives. Some of them had incredibly adventurous lives. One of them married someone who traveled to the wildest, remotest regions of what is now a state called Arkansas, and traded with Native Americans, did fur trading with them. They would have spent their lives with living in almost total isolation, living among indigenous peoples, doing with a kind of adventurous life that no one in France would have known. That's one kind of life. Others moved to the opposite end of this, moved and helped build the city known as New Orleans. And they were among the first residents of New Orleans. Of the first 10 marriages celebrated in the city of New Orleans, 5 of those brides had traveled in these conditions. The slave ship on which they traveled was called La Mutine in French, the mutinous woman. So that's the title of my book, Mutinous Women, as though they were dangerous women on this slave ship. And in New Orleans, those women learned quickly, they were quick learners, that if you cleared land and built on it, you became a property owner. So women who had nothing in Paris, as you were saying, are all of a sudden, fairly quickly, it was not an easy task, but they become property owners. This is land, unbelievably difficult to clear, right? You have to uproot trees and cut back vegetation, do all of this. And they weren't much, the houses they built, but they were their own. So they had homes, they owned a bit of land. And one of the women who was falsely accused of murder, it's a long story. I go into it in detail in the book because it's such an interesting story. She ended up owning 5.5 lots in the center of New Orleans. She married a blacksmith, and they were hard workers, and they cleared all this land. So this is a kind of story of being able to, a place that doesn't want you and throws you out as undesirable, the place where you land, they became important citizens. When this woman died, in her will, the 5 men who came to witness her will called her dame, lady. In other words, she had a title of respect because she had been such an outstanding citizen and had contributed so much to the city of New Orleans in the first years of its existence. So those are all stories, I think, of incredible social ascension. Some of them married very well and had huge families. And they had so many children, and their children had many children. Today, one of the main reason I wanted to do this book is that it seemed to me that so many children, descendants of these women, and there are many, many today. I'll tell you about them if you're interested in a minute. They don't know about their ancestors past, and they've always been told that the women were prostitutes and thieves. And it's not I don't think it's a source of pride to pass down your family story as, we're all descended from this prostitute. So I think that one reason this story and the past of these women in Louisiana has been neglected is because people are ashamed of it.
Well, another positive sign that I get from your book is that we are always highlighting the accomplishment of the men explorer and or conquerors, or the men who developed the land, etc., etc. And here you are highlighting the contribution and the leadership of some of these women who were put there against their will, but once they were facing this situation, they excel and they managed to progress and prosper and do a lot of good in a new life that was trusted upon them. And I think this is a great way to see history as well, that not everything is done and created by the white man, that there is a huge contribution and leadership from the part of the woman as well.
I totally agree with you. For me, it was, I realized early on as I was doing the work for this project that this was a really rare possibility of being able to study a contained group of mostly, they were all poor, mostly socially very modest backgrounds. A few had families that were higher up socially, but poor, all poor women with nothing in the home country, to see what happened when they were put in a new environment across the world, what they were able to do. It's a kind of women's history, I think, that can't often be studied because you can't find the records. It is because of all these false arrests in Paris that there's so many records. And once I had those, I was able to trace them and often trace their families, etc. But I couldn't have done that without the police's help. So the police, in a way, helped all of us. I often wondered if the women would have chosen this if they had known where they would be, but look what they had to go through to get there. But it is a different view of what would have happened. I also want to stress they were almost all illiterate.
Right.
So they were taking a system in which people, couldn't even understand the documents, the rests and everything. Sometimes the police they always had to end by saying they didn't know how to read or write. So they were powerless in the system, but they managed to understand it and to make it work. It really gives me the sense that if only we could learn more about the contributions of those from outside the power structure to our nations, we might have a very different story.
Well, Joan, I cannot get enough of this book. I'm so excited that you wrote it. I wonder if there is any question that I should have asked you that I didn't before we close up this interview.
Okay, one, if you don't mind. Their descendants, how many?
Yes.
And where are they?
How many and where are they?
Yeah. We don't have time, right?
Well, no, yes, please.
Okay, because it's so
sir.
incredible.
Yes,
Today,
please,
they have, I can't count them because they don't know who they are, right? Every day this week, the book appeared on Tuesday. Every day this week, I have received an email from someone new saying, I'm a direct descendant of, and I live in. My favorite one was someone who said, I'm a direct descendant of two of them. I now realize, wow. Both on my father's side and on my mother's side. He lives in Washington, D.C. People have contacted me from California, from New Jersey, from New York State, from Colorado, from Arkansas, Texas. They're everywhere. Their names are different now, of course, because these were women. So they've in all the marriages over time, but there is that shared past, and who knows how many descendants they had. And in my mind, that's their most remarkable legacy.
Last year I subscribe to this, I don't even know what to call it, but this service 23andMe, which allows me to see my family tree. I wonder, I mean, how are these people finding out that these women they are the descendant of this woman?
They have names, you see, of ancestors, but they don't know who they are. So all of a sudden they're learning that say a man's name, that if I'm telling them that was because in the book who was the wife of that man, then they realize, oh, that's my first female ancestor in this country, and then they can trace it down. So It's filling in the blanks.
Wow. Okay. Well, this is a great contribution to America's history and a history that until now no one has taken the time to highlight. So thank you so much for your work.
And thank you for having me. I'm so glad to have people interested in this. The women deserve it.
Well, one last question. Can you tell us one last time the title of the book and where can the listener follow the work that you're doing?
Okay, it's called Mutinous Women. It's published by Basic Books, and you can find it. I mean, I hate to, you can find it at independent bookstores. You can find it on Amazon, of course, any source, any place where you can buy books. I'm presuming, I don't know about Quebec, but I'm betting you can get it pretty easily even there.
Well, I tell you what, if it's not in my local library, I'm going to suggest it because, of course, it's just part of the heritage of this of North America. So yeah, it's not only the French that came to Quebec, but it's also the French that went to Louisiana that makes part of this Francophonie here.
It does. Thank you so much. Could I send you a link that do you have on your podcast?
Yes, I will put all this.
I'll do that. I'll send it to the Basic Books page.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to you. Nice to talk to you.